I guess I'm just acknowledging I haven't spent a deep amount of time considering what else we would want to include.
Okay.
And I haven't received any specific feedback to me directly about this piece of it, about the membership, or any specific resistance, other than I think we had voiced like just trying to manage a larger table, comes with its own set of needs, but not really being voiced in a way that was stopping the conversation.
Okay. Anybody else? We all kind of on the same page?
I think so. The only thing I want to add, just so we don't miss it, it wasn't specifically related to this question, the way we posed it to the ICH, but some things did come up during the ICH meeting, whatever it was, last meeting. I think it was when Catherine was going over the action plan implementation. And I honestly, I was off last week, so I don't remember completely, but Lindsay and I presented to the ICH the work that the membership committee has been doing, and really, to my memory, no feedback really at all. And then I think it was, like I said, I think it was when Catherine was talking about action planning and who was at the table. And that's, Lindsay, you're going to have to help me, but there was some resistance about who would be at the table, specifically related to transparency and the decision making around some things that state partners would be bringing to the table, and who would maybe be involved in that, why they would have to do that, or why anyone would be asking them to do that, and that sort of thing. So that was a little alarming.
Ashley, could you give me some specifics around transparency around what would be asked of ICH? Transparency around, I'm still not clear.
I'm not either, because I don't remember. But I do remember it was MDHHS representative talking about transparency related to decision making, I believe, about I think we were talking about why, like if a new program came up, kind of how allocation decisions were made, and more specific things about the programming.
Okay.
Am I remembering that right, Lindsay?
Yeah, that sounds right. I'm like digging through my notes.
Me too.
Of course, I didn't like write things down. Jason, were there things also captured in the notes that you took that could be helpful, like reminders of what happened?
Yeah, so I do remember that conversation occurring, but I actually think it was in the context of the ICH and not necessarily
Yeah.
the policy council. And so the context was the ICH was asked to identify, there are four pieces of the current action plan that the ICH has been asked to champion. And during the meeting, Catherine kicked off a conversation with the ICH members around prioritizing, recognizing that this is uncharted territory for them and they have no capacity to take on all four. So, of the four, which one kind of rises to the top? And there was a lot of back and forth about transparency. So the comments that were made with the folks at the table were, from what I remember, it was more focused on funding allocations and the new programs. But there was an argument that I think one or two of the ICH members were putting out that in order to have a good understanding of what's happening we need to have this transparency and understand what resources are flowing into the communities and what resources are kind of across the board being allocated or dedicated to ending homelessness. And then once we have a sense of kind of where the money's at and what it's allocated for, then we can have some conversations about changing things up. But that was, that was solidly in the mix of a bigger conversation. Like I said, it was around prioritizing. And kind of on the flip side of that, there was actually a small contingent of members that were really pushing for the ICH to take on policies and procedures. So like identifying known obstacles and beginning to brainstorm ways that we could blow those up.
Okay.
Yeah, and I just want to say around the transparency, things are like starting to come back to me. One of the like items that we were specifically talking about was or like being really making all of the resources that are available within the various state departments that touch homelessness, like what are those, how are they allocated, like what is the funding solution, who gets those grants, like being really transparent facing, like some of that's available, some of it's not. um um and looking at it from a kind of state perspective. And then I think maybe Ashley, this was what you were talking about, that I think there were one or two people that were very focused on the like, how do we make sure that it like saying that like looking at the community resources was more important and how those resources were used. And then at the end of the conversation, there was like some mention of the makeup of the ICH. And I don't remember who said it, but if we're looking at the makeup of the policy council, like also looking at the makeup of the ICH as well, and specifically, I think someone brought up just that it isn't a group that's racially diverse, or kind of reflective of the state overall. And so that comment came up as well.
Okay. All right. So I think we need to maybe use some time during our PCT meeting tomorrow, if possible, to think about how ICH might fit into some of this work when it comes to aligning the state action plan and their responsibilities under that plan with our racial equity work and how we want them to be involved with advancing equity. I think we need to make sure that we're engaging them in a way that's aligned with the state plan, but also, I think if we can understand what their concerns are, understand what their priorities are around shifting their membership body to be more inclusive, and if they need any kind of support from this engagement to do that. Does it make sense to speak about that at PCT? Or do you feel like that's a part of this work with the membership committee for the council?
I mean, I think it's important to talk about. I'm just also thinking through like kind of the alignment of the work, and we're starting with the policy council, which is really what this subcommittee's discussions about. Like how do we manage the membership of this group, and what can we do? And I think that there's definitely things we can bring to ICH as like, here's what we recommend, or here's what we're seeing, or here's like feedback. But I feel like if we try to I don't know, tackle or address both at the same time, it could be easily diverted. Like, well, that's a governor's order that sets up ICH. Like there's other influences and measures involved with that group that need different types of conversation, I think, to move the needle. We have a lot more direct ability within the membership of the policy council to look at, how can we shore up what our intentions are here and be able to move the group in that direction. The other thing too, I was just reflecting on some of the updates from the ICH discussion, and I wanted, and maybe this is about alignment too, at least from my perspective, like I want to make sure that we want to get the membership where it needs to be, and then have the members, this newly formed or newly aligned membership, give space to that new group to really dig into some of these other areas, because I feel like we're kind of like trying to tie a lot of things to this particular space at the moment. And I'm not saying that these other things aren't valuable or don't need to be discussed, but I feel like we might be like moving things around too quickly to try to address it all at once.
How do others
Yeah.
feel about that? Yeah? Okay.
I completely agree. Yeah. I just feel like this work with the policy council is kind of more impactful at the moment. And then can help, I think, inform the ICH in the future.
Okay. And everybody else good with that? We'll stay focused on the council for now. Okay. I'm gonna run through the recap, but I do want to highlight something that I think is important. So when we met with the Homeless Policy Council, we reviewed these two models, right? We reviewed the one in Connecticut and we reviewed this one that's happening in Minnesota. After presenting this, we're providing some HUD TA in Minnesota, and so we're working closely with the community that we highlighted, the Suburban Metro Area COC. Their Directors Council, their group that we highlighted, has some serious complaints recently about not feeling like they are having an impact, or at least not knowing what impact they're having. And so I want to bring that to you because it's not just about setting up the structures. And I know I've talked about this so many times. The structure worked initially, but they're now the TA that we're providing is really about ensuring that there is ongoing open communication and transparency, and they have the supports that they need, and things are being communicated back to them about which recommendations that they lifted up are being followed through with and what the outcomes of those are. And so that's the only reason I really want to talk about this again, because things change, things shift, and it's a caution for us about what it means to have true authentic engagement, that it takes a lot of capacity and some manpower on the ground to make sure people are supported and to make sure the culture is shifting and people's voices are valued and that they have and hold real power.
Lisa, did you say that the feedback was from the people with lived experience not feeling heard, or the
Right.
directors?
Oh, I'm sorry. It was from the Directors Council is the people with lived experience. It's all made up of people with lived experience. Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So, I don't want to air out any of their business, but I want to just make it really clear that it's not as easy as kind of bringing people on and so.
Yeah,
Okay.
I did. Sorry, your message. You said something, and I tried to write it down, but I totally screwed it up. But like I, your message, and you've said it a lot, that like culture, like shifting culture, takes time and takes work and takes support, and I feel like that's something. I know we've talked about it here, but like I feel like that's not on other people's radars, like at the larger policy council group. And so if there are ways when we go back to engage with them to highlight that, it just feels really important.
Yeah.
And I'll go back and listen to the recording and write down exactly what you said.
And I'm happy to have, conversations about that if needed, just to kind of drive it home. But I didn't feel like I was doing that community justice without talking about some of the adaptive leadership challenges that they're facing right now. So just bringing that to the forefront. Okay. Going back to our Jamboard, I'm hoping today we can make some like quick and dirty decisions, at least decisions about recommendations. So let's talk about where there is consensus according to the Jamboard. It seems most people felt that the total number of seats should be around 20.
What's the number now? Does anyone know off the top of their head?
22 or 23, depending on how we define Bill Hardeman's seat.
Okay.
Okay. It also seems that people felt the number of seats for people with lived experience should be around 25%, which is 5 seats. And some people said at least 25%. Some people said we should work up to 25%. But if you go back to the Jamboard, you can kind of look at, you know, why I think there was consensus around that. I think most people were kind of leaning to in that direction. When we asked about how to ensure that Black, Indigenous, and people of color were represented, there were some great recommendations. So that's what I put here, that you know, this one, it wasn't about consensus. It was more about like, let's collect some thoughts about how we do this, right? So you have to have the information first and foremost, right? You have to collect the demographics of existing and new members. So maybe part of the application process, that's a question that you're asking with real transparency around why you're asking that, because otherwise people are going to be like, why do I have to give you all this personal information? And so you want to make sure you're collecting that information. Being intentional in outreach and recruitment. So making sure that you're doing some targeted outreach, right? If there's, you know, someone from the COC who typically represents that community and it's a white male, it's okay to say, this is what we're aiming to achieve. We're trying to have a more diverse and inclusive and anti-racist membership. And are there other folks in your community who can speak for your community, who have the information that they need, and if not, that you could allow them to shadow you, you can allow them to, you know, have a transition period where maybe they come on after you. Whatever it is, you want to make sure that you're being intentional. And then there were questions around how do we make sure this is not tokenistic engagement? And that really is the culture shift piece. It's not something that I can give you a formula for or an answer for. It really is about constantly monitoring how folks feel in the new structure and getting feedback from folks, making sure that people have the information that they need to participate in a meaningful way, especially if they're new to this process. It's making sure that you wait and make sure everybody has time on the floor if they're contributing to something that's being decided on or recommendations that you're forming. So it really is about shifting culture a bit, and we can talk about that. Where we still need to build some consensus. So when we asked about who should be the ex officio members based on the seats and positions they currently hold, 2 people had questions about, you know, well, we don't really even understand what decisions are being made by the council, and without that, I can't tell you who should be here. The recommendations were, you know, elected officials, state funders, and people named these different state organizations. Jump in if you have thoughts and if you have questions. When it came, yep.
Sorry.
No.
I just had a question about the slide before, a couple of, if that's okay.
Of course.
On the consensus, it's on that how to ensure BIPOC representation. the first two around collecting demographics, and you had mentioned in the application and being intentional about outreach. I think what's in between the lines here for me also is that, like, right now there isn't an application for the appointed seats, like the state departments or the ex officio seats. And there's not really intentional outreach and engagement. And so I think what I'm hearing is that with all numbers, we need some sort of application, some sort of way of collecting that demographic information, and then also being intentional with that group as well. Is that what I'm
Yeah,
hearing?
so
Okay.
even if it's not an application, and even if you just send out a survey to your existing members to collect the information and to let them know why you're collecting the information, that would get you the data that you need on the existing folks. A decision has to be made about what the application process will look like, and if everybody will have to go through that. And if so, what information do you want to collect in that process as well? Any other questions on this slide?
I think this might lead into the ex officio conversation on the next slide and to what Lindsay just brought up. I feel like too, there might be for, if it's defined for specific state entities or funders, like you have this one seat. Yeah, I'd be curious to think through like what type of application process would that be for the state entity. Just knowing that participation in the policy council now seems to be tied to like this is your role, like this is your role within the agency, so this just comes as part of your responsibilities to that position. So so that just might be something for us to keep in mind too, like it, because of how this has been structured. It's not to say we couldn't consider, make recommendations of like other ways to determine who from any one agency participates, but that's just been my experience, at least up to this point. It's just kind of been like, oh, you are this position, so you are attending these meetings and participating in this way.
Yeah. And can it be you are this position, and how do you develop leadership for Black, Indigenous, and people of color within your department who can represent you at this meeting? How can we, so that is how it's always been, but that's not necessarily how it always has to be, right? So just exploring alternative ways to think about the representation of those agencies and opportunities to create some transition there, even if those folks stay for now.
So it
No,
sounds,
I agree, that totally makes sense.
I was just thinking another option for folks would be, instead of saying the person with this title attends, that you just say like, I know that that person's been attending forever. Is there someone else, like Lisa had said previously? Right? Does that make sense? I don't know if that would for every agency, because I don't know that DHHS is going to send someone that doesn't have anything to do with housing and homelessness, but
Yeah. And it is not expected that every single person on your council is going to be someone who identifies as Black, Indigenous, and a person of color. That's not the expectation. We just want to make sure that we are pushing our partners to intentionally think about a more inclusive membership and building leadership in their organizations and shifting the way that they think, that this seat is entitled to them. And, we just want to shake things up a bit there. What about that
actually
first
seems like
part?
Go ahead.
I was just saying, what about that first part? Because I know that we're not necessarily at a point where we're defining what decisions are made by the council or the role of the council, but that's what comes up sometimes when people are trying to decide on who should be at the table. How do you, is that something you're thinking about taking on? Is that on hold? How do you address the concerns or questions that council members have?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't think that's for this group to define. Do other people think that it is? I mean, I feel like that's probably a collective decision, or, I mean, it also seems kind of, I don't even know what adjective to use, but that this body exists and meets all the time, and like there's a lot of unclarity around that.
I guess my quiet was more about trying to think through the question you're asking, Lisa, with like what, because there are a lot of questions that we get, and there's a lot of information that we've shared through the policy council, and things that we've reiterated and defined and like tried to underscore for folks. Like, we have bylaws for the policy council. This is what leads the work. These are the activities and the responsibilities of the council. Like, we've gone through that, and we've said, like, these are all things that are open to change, like discussion. And then I felt like with this group, we said, to make change, we want to make sure that we start with the inclusive and better defined table to like work through those changes. So I just want to make sure you said that there were like, how are we addressing the questions? And I guess the first part, I just want to make sure, like, which questions, I guess, are we
So on this
about?
particular Jamboard page, when we asked who should hold a seat based on the positions that they have, there were a couple of comments related to, we need to better understand the role of the council, the decisions we'll be making to determine who should be there. But you're saying, let's switch that. Let's make sure we have the right folks at the table so that we can then determine what we have agency over, what we want to have agency over, and start to have those conversations after.
Yeah, well, and I guess I'm just wondering, like, because we can't see who's bringing these questions forward.
Right.
Like, I'd like to say first, like, hey, we recorded this bylaws presentation that talks about all the things that this group does. So if you're unclear, like, please take a look at that. And if it's still not making sense, like, reach out to, myself or Ashley or Jason. Like, we'll meet with you one-on-one to kind of like walk through this and make sure it's understood. Because I just want to make sure, and I'm not trying to be dismissive of the questions, but just like understand how we can better clarify, because we've gone through that a few times. And I just, yeah, I do feel like making a bunch of changes before we have a more inclusive membership, like, for me, I guess it doesn't feel like it follows a good flow in terms of like how we can help folks feel like they're engaged in the action of what the group's doing.
Well, and honestly, like, even like when we had Catherine from CSH come in and walk everybody through the prioritization within the action plan, similar exercise to what we did with, so for Lisa's benefit, what we did with ICH like 2 weeks ago, Catherine did that with us with the policy council back in February. And even during that exercise, like, folks were asking, like, what's the point of this group? While we were talking about like prioritizing the things the group should be doing. So we've got this, I mean, and this is after everything that Christina shared. Like, I mean, last fall, we spent a lot of time intentionally walking everybody through the role of the group, the bylaws, what the group is responsible for oversight. I mean, there's like 13 or 14 things, all kind of pointed towards the aim of ending, preventing and ending homelessness. This group is supposed to be overseeing.
Yeah.
And we felt like the action plan, the launch of the new action plan back in January was like a good way for this group to really get like some hooks. because it was actionable. It gives the group something to do. Yeah, so thanks to whoever just dropped that in the chat. Yeah,
It was
those are
Lindsay.
yeah, those are the things the group's supposed to be doing.
Okay, so
Um,
I think, and I just want to say this because it came up multiple times. I think it speaks to the fact that people on this council don't feel that they have actual power
Yes.
Yeah,
to do
I feel
anything.
like, oh, sorry.
I
go
was
ahead.
just gonna say, I think what Lisa's saying is true. I think what Christina is saying is true, but I think that like people don't see it like in action. Or
Yeah.
they're not watching any of those things or paying attention, right? But let's assume they are. So I don't know if there's like a way during the meetings to like, I don't know, like say like this is this thing we just discussed and here how does it relates back to it's one of these letters. I don't know. I just think that people have very short, they don't think about things in a big picture way all the time. They're thinking about like what it feels like to be in a meeting and like what they feel like they're contributing, and they don't see it all. Does, if that makes
Yeah.
sense, like at all.
It does
They're
make
having
sense.
trouble connecting.
Well,
It
I
does make
think
sense.
people aren't being asked to make decisions. And I think to me, when people, what that is the like having questions about what is the role, if I'm not being asked to be part of a decision making, yes, the list of these things I think are helpful to frame like what the group's purpose is. But if I'm not asking to be voting on something or consensus or whatever, it might feel like, okay, what are we doing? We're just talking about things. And I would imagine that's where the question like some of the questions came from. But, and I also agree with Christina that I feel like we have to have like a new table, if you will, to like maybe dig into these things and talk about like, okay, how do we make decisions about these? Like, if these are the things, yeah.
So as we go through this process, you all will be meeting with the council once a month to kind of fill them in on where we stand. And you will have to do some consensus building. And if those questions come up, it sounds like there's, an agreed or shared kind of understanding of how and when you will start to think through, helping folks define what the charge of the council is. So it sounds like that is something to discuss when the right people are fully at the table and you can get the input from the members that make up this new inclusive body, right? So I think that's fine to say we're going to press pause on that conversation and that work. But I do think everything that's listed in the chat about the role of the council, I think, people have to understand that you're a convener, that you're a planning body, that you're making recommendations, that you're helping to assess certain resources and whatnot, but that this body is not making decisions about policy, is not making decisions about A, B, C, and D. And then the discussion needs to happen about whether or not that's something the entire council wants to shift and advocate for, right? That there will be decisions that we can make about the VI SPDAT or about this or about that, other than just making recommendations. So I think what I'm hearing from Christina, what I'm hearing from everybody totally makes sense. We're pressing pause on that, right? For now, about the role of the council. Is that?
I think so, but I think we have to like, I feel like we need to tell people we hear you.
Yes.
And we're intentionally pressing pause on this, and here's why.
And I think you'll have opportunities to do that when you're checking in with them once a month about this, because you're going to have to build consensus and those questions are going to come back up. Or you can just say, we heard you, we reviewed your feedback on the Jamboard. We know that there's still some, clarity that people are looking for. Here is the current process, everything in the chat right now. Here is what we have responsibility for. Other things that we've heard that people want to be able to make decisions about are A, B, C, and D. We will move forward with that discussion when we get the right folks at the table. Does that sound okay? Okay. Even the decisions that we're kind of clear about, we're making decisions for now. right? Because those people are going to come to the table and they might say, we need more people with lived experience, or we need more seats, we need more COC representation. And those things can shift when you get other folks at the table, and that's okay. They don't have to be decisions that are final. We just want to start making some movement. Okay, there was not real consensus with COC representation, other than it seems like there's agreement that it should be a mix of rural and urban. One person suggested that there should at least be a Detroit-specific seat, almost like an ex officio member. Two people agreed that the COC leadership group could elect or select 5 to 7 COC staff to be on the council, and then perhaps rotating them by term so that there's other representation by other communities on a rotating basis. So these last two make a lot of sense to me. They seem to work together. And if you have a leadership group who's willing to consider 5 to 7 COCs that are a mix of rural and urban communities, I think that you can easily get to this without too much tension. How do others feel about that one?
I think it's a good idea. We just don't have that group. I mean, we
The
had
COC
it.
leadership group
No,
doesn't exist?
it did for a few minutes, and then we shifted it into, okay, now we're going to do the race equity work. And so it's certs, and we haven't reconvened the group.
Okay.
Not that we couldn't,
Mm-hmm.
but
Yeah, I think there's intention to bring that group back together. There's definitely interest. I think at the time, I don't think it was like a unilateral, like top down kind of decision, but more of a how can we make best use of everybody's time right now sort of decision when the certs were coming forward and all of the development and support that was needed there. So I think it's been paused, kind of similar to other stuff.
Okay, but could be reconvened and maybe, yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We put this question on there because we heard that nobody was stepping up to be in the role of fiduciary for partners with lived experience, and there wasn't really consensus. A few folks brought up the backbone organization, and I highlighted that here because it was also something that when we were presenting at the council, people kept saying, well, that's something that is a gap. We don't have a backbone organization. And I wanted to talk through that a little bit and see what your thoughts were there. I think my assumption was that Mishta kind of played that role with coordinating and convening and building consensus. But I want to hear what you all have to say about this particular piece. Is this a gap for the council? Is it something that's needed? And do you have thoughts about who would step into that role?
I feel like it's a gap. I feel like it's absolutely needed. And I think you're right that Mishta has played this role and funded this role. But never has it been explicitly like called the backbone or like the playing the fiduciary role for the campaign. And so if I feel like we're introducing some of this language that might be new for folks about like why the campaign would need something like this, I feel like we might need to connect dots more for people. I don't know.
Yeah, and listening to what you said, Lindsay, I'm wondering too if we just need to clarify, like, I thought this question was about fiduciary specifically for people with lived expertise and how they're being paid for their time as part of the policy council work. And I think what I was hearing you saying was like broader than that, right? Like a fiduciary to the work of the campaign, which is bigger and broader. And I know that there's ongoing discussions about how to staff, the campaign overall and how best to support, like more specifically, like the state action plan and things like that. So was I hearing you right? Like, were you talking about that too, or were you thinking specifically for the folks with lived expertise piece for the policy council?
So this is feedback from our jam board where I was asking specifically about how people with lived experience were going to be funded and who would serve in the role as fiduciary for them. On the jam board, people responded to that question with, that should be the backbone organization. So I put it on here as a question because it doesn't exist at this point, right? So I'm not sure if it's something that we're diving into or not. It's here because people believe that, or at least a few people mentioned that if that role were filled, they would best serve as a fiduciary, whoever was in that role. This might be another pause. I'm basing that on everybody's reaction to this one.
No, I think I'm still processing the comments on a backbone organization and trying to think of what all of that means or encompasses, like just based on those comments, like what was being maybe proposed or set up there.
So when I think about a backbone, I think about like the collective impact model. I think about who is bringing data, who is creating a shared agenda, who is helping to make sure that the right folks are at the table, who is
paying attention to culture. Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry.
And holding people accountable, or not people, but partners and organizations. But again, usually a backbone organization is funded to do that work. It's not just somebody who volunteers and says, well, our agency can act as the backbone. It needs to be staffed, that work, right? So maybe this is another thing that we talk through later.
I think people put it because Catherine talked about how we would want a backbone organization as a possibility when she was talking about like how to push the work of the action plan through during that meeting.
Okay.
So I'm not saying we need to discuss it now, but I think that's where that came from. Saying that it was a model we could have in the future. So yes, that I think would be a pause because it does not exist.
The other things that people recommended were MICA or CSH, or potentially the COC staffing agency in the home community.
And I wonder how much of that is about where the sources of funding are to pay for people's time. So, because I know with COC planning dollars could be applied in that direction, right? For staffing, representation, that level of engagement, which would be important to consider if there's not another established source of funding. And I guess what I'm thinking of is like at the state level. So MHPC, we have grants with both CSH and MICA for a variety of purposes. I know historically with MICA, we've had inclusion of lived expertise, and I think that's part of the proposal for funding going forward too. But whether or not it was specific to the policy council and providing the costs for that role. I think that would have to be navigated, and it just makes it complicated trying to have a specific grant application discussion for either, I would think, MICA or CSH in their applications to MHPC, and having that discussion with the full policy council as far as how they're applying for funds or how they want to use the funds from MHPC.
This last part here related to COC staffing, if there are communities across the state that have lived experience coalitions or advisory councils who are already being funded and they're willing to participate in a statewide planning group, there may be a lot of benefit in that for those partners actually to be able to have more impact, to be able to expand their leadership, to be able to network with other partners with lived experience. It would just be about making sure they had the support at the meetings that they needed. Because if their home community had no representation there, it might be really easy for them to get lost in those meetings.
Mhm.
And transitioning from some of the work that they might be doing locally to some of the work of this council would probably be a big shift as well. You're on mute, Lindsay.
Sorry. Even if the COC is paying for it, I do feel, isn't it still there? Could it still be the responsibility of the staffing of the policy council to also support the, like, even no matter where they're or how their time's being compensated, that the staffing is still supporting people? Because I
Yeah,
agree they could still very much get lost.
Yeah, realistically, the staff should be supporting all new members and onboarding all new members and making sure everybody has the minutes from the last meeting if they missed it, and outreaching folks who have, missed a few meetings. And, realistically, there's probably some of that happening with any member, but yes, we would want to make sure that we understood the needs of partners with lived experience and that there was capacity to support them at the statewide level. I also have to jump in 2 minutes because I'm running another meeting, but I wanted to just see, going back to this last slide, are these things that we can move forward with? And thinking through, who are the existing members? Who are you gonna say, you know what, you haven't showed up for like 6 months, so thinking about who else you want to engage and move forward with. Around 20, there's a little leeway there. You might want to outreach more than that because some folks are going to say no anyways. And we still have a lot of work to do, right? I mean, I added some pages on the Jamboard. This one is on pause. This is something that you all provided feedback for, but it doesn't sound like we're jumping into it now. And then I wanted to just talk about what this means as far as implementation, because we still have to make decisions about what an application process looks like. We have to define the number of seats for COC representation. And I know 5 to 7 was thought about. The ex officio members, we didn't really make a decision about today. We need to think about what the length of terms would be for those COC representatives. The backbone organization is on pause. But thinking about what an orientation and onboarding process would look like, because we don't want to invite new members in without having that standardized yet, right? Without being able to make sure everybody has a glossary of acronyms if they need it, or the roles that you listed out in the chat, just making sure everybody has an understanding of who the partners currently are and everything they need for onboarding, what the state action plan is, where your responsibilities are laid out in that plan, all of those. So we can still work through this. This was the page that I think, Lindsay, you asked me to add to that other Jamboard we were working on, and I just wanted to make sure we made some space to pay attention to that before we move forward with implementing any changes. Let's talk about things that state partners have done before and how to, that didn't go as intended, and learning from some mistakes. And, just giving you kind of a heads up, but we also want to continue to have the discussion about culture, right? So we will do that. I'm gonna pause on this homework that I had set up in the Jamboard, because the homework that I want you to focus on is really this one. So thinking through this, revisiting who is a current member and why, thinking about the existing members that don't need to be there because they haven't been showing up, thinking about the skills and knowledge and experience that you still need around the table, application process. So if you could do a little bit of work together to think through some of this before we come back, so we know how many seats are available and open, how many we're adding, that would be really cool. And I have to jump because I'm actually opening that other meeting, but thank you so much. And Jason, if you could send me the recording, that would be great. Thank
Thanks,
you,
Lisa.
everybody.
Thanks.